Hello Revolution students, and welcome back to another video on the Chinese Revolution area of study 2. In this video I'm going to continue looking at the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and I will focus on two things in particular: the phases of the Cultural Revolution and the tools or instruments which were used to implement the Cultural Revolution throughout Chinese society. So we'll start with the phases. So the first phase began, well, that first period was from May to November 1966, and that's when we see the Red Guards emerging in Chinese society. Terror anarchy starts gripping and spreading through Chinese society, and it's when the Red Guards with the PLA were used by Mao to re-establish his authority over the CCP. It's also at this time where we see those two main capitalist roaders, Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, when they were forced to give self-criticisms before the Central Committee on the 23rd of October 1966. In phase 2, this is when the CCP, you can see, pretty much lost authority within society. The Central Committee of the CCP ceased to function effectively, and it's when groups like the radical workers in Shanghai arose and established their independent commune, which was pretty much, an independent commune where the workers ran everything in Shanghai, outside of any authority from the CCP or the PLA. The final phase of the Cultural Revolution was this February 1967 to 1969. And that's when Mao comes to the realization that everything's falling apart. Anarchy has gripped China, and he realizes that he needs to re-establish some sort of government authority over society. So he turns to the PLA, and he uses them to re-establish control over both the radical workers in Shanghai and the Red Guards throughout the countryside. This is when Liu Shaoqi is expelled from the party, put into prison, and it's when the Red Guards are sent out to the countryside to cool off by Mao Zedong and to learn from the peasants, and in some ways, I suppose, to reform through hard labour. So that is the three phases of the Cultural Revolution. That third phase there from 1969, after 1969, the Cultural Revolution does continue, obviously, but Mao Zedong is in firm control, and the Gangan Four, under his authority, are implementing the Cultural Revolution within Chinese society. Our study finishes in 1971 with the fall of Lin Biao, but the Cultural Revolution itself continues right up to Mao's death in 1976. Okay, let's now have a look at the tools or instruments of the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, and there were several. The first one was Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and the Gang of Four. So Jiang Qing was, you can see there's the members there: Jiang Qing, Zhang Chunqiao, Yao Wenyuan, and Wang Hongwen. So they were the Gang of Four, and they were the driving force, under Mao's authority obviously, of the Cultural Revolution. Jiang in particular, so she played a key role. She's the one who encouraged the Red Guard movement. She was also the patron, there you can see, of the 8 revolutionary operas, and she also played a key role in censoring the arts during the 1960s. The Red Guards themselves obviously were a key instrument of the Cultural Revolution, and we've looked at this before, but we'll go over it again. So they emerged in May 1966 at a middle school connected to Beijing University. And as I referred to before, when things got really out of hand and Mao felt that he was losing authority, he eventually got the PLA in to rein these Red Guards in, and then he sent them up to the countryside to cool off during the Up to the Mountains, Down to the Countryside campaign, which lasted from 1968 to 1972. I believe Xi Jinping, the current president of China, he was actually sent up to the mountains and down to the countryside himself during this period. So the Red Guards, they played a key role in struggles against reactionaries, rightists, and capitalist roaders within society. So they're the ones who conducted the struggle sessions. They're the ones who attacked intellectuals, teachers at primary schools and middle schools and at universities, lecturers at universities. And they also implemented the 4 roles, which we're going to look at in more detail in a later video. Finally, there was the Little Red Book itself, and you can see a picture up there in the top right of Red Guards reading, or PLA soldiers, sorry, reading the Little Red Book. And it was first published in May 1968 for PLA soldiers and for mass readership in September 1966. So it was actually compiled before the launch of the Cultural Revolution. It was compiled by Lin Biao, who was the head of the army at that time, and he made sure that all PLA soldiers read it. And then obviously when the Cultural Revolution launched, then it was given for mass readership in September 1966. 40 billion copies printed, so there were numerous copies for each individual within China, each person, and it contributed to the cult of Mao. The Little Red Book itself, it became so significant during this period that if you did not carry a Little Red Book on you, then you were seen as a rightist or a reactionary, and then you would be struggled against. And there are numerous accounts of teachers and other people who were attacked because even though they were supporting the Cultural Revolution at that time, they may not have been carrying their Little Red Book, and they were attacked as a consequence. I have just here a little extract or a little quote from the foreword to the Little Red Book, which was written by Lin Biao in 1967, and I'll just read through it very quickly. So, Comrade Mao Zedong is the greatest Marxist-Leninist of our era. He has inherited, defended, and developed Marxism-Leninism with genius, creatively and comprehensively, and has brought it to a higher and completely new stage. Once Mao Zedong's thought is grasped by the broad masses, it becomes an inexhaustible source of strength and a spiritual atom bomb of infinite power. So there you go, a very, very powerful text. All right, let's have a look at a couple of historical interpretations now about the Cultural Revolution. And the first one is by Jonathan Themby there from his Penguin History of Modern China. And he writes, despite having been in charge since the foundation of the PRC, Mao was not seen as the source of all the problems from which the country suffered. Given the hallowed status of the leader and his thoughts, the onus for the failure of the revolution must, therefore, lie with those around him. To have laid blame at his door would have been to bring the whole edifice into question. So yet another lie was erected as the chairman's new offering was presented as a vista of liberation to students, women, peasants and workers. The Cultural Revolution. The sudden freedom to speak out against authority was intoxicating. In schools, pupils could criticise and terrorise teachers. In families, children could stand up to their fathers. There was also self-interest at play. The way in which junior staff at universities raided files for damaging materials to use against their superiors in wall posters was not simply a matter of a political search for dirt. If the seniors were forced, positions would fall vacant, forced out. A cadre from a factory reflected that it was an ideal opportunity for the incompetent to grab jobs. So juniors were getting rid of the seniors, workers were getting rid of their bosses, junior lecturers were getting rid of professors in order to gain those positions themselves, according to Jonathan Themby. Historical interpretation number 2 is from Philip Short, and he writes, but the irony was that to bring into existence his new world, the chairman, Mao Zedong, had reached back to his roots, to the bedrock of his thought, to the days when China was ruled by a son of heaven, the red sun in our hearts, to forge an emperor system whose limitless power, once harnessed to revolutionary goals, could build the red utopia to which he pinned his dreams. So Philip Short, what he's talking about there, and it's a major theme in a lot of the propaganda posters that were produced during the Cultural Revolution. Many of them had Mao Zedong on high as the red sun beaming down his wonderful rays of light onto the Chinese people and illuminating them with his revolutionary wisdom. And much of this imagery, many of these ideas were based upon those ideas that had been promoted by the former emperors during the imperial period in China's long history. Anyway, that is a couple of historical interpretations about the Cultural Revolution. I hope you have learnt a bit about the phases of the Cultural Revolution, as well as the instruments or tools that we use to implement the Cultural Revolution in China. And with that, I will end this video. So I shall see you next time. Goodbye.